Hey, thanks for tuning in this week. We are going to talk jailbreak. Yeah, truly. Because as I'm recording this, we've just had, I would say the jailbreak, the wildest jailbreak in recent memory here in New Orleans. 10 inmates escaped in the middle of the night, and only 3 have been recaptured so far. And of course, the facts are still murky. And by the time you're listening to this, much more is probably clear about what transpired and where the individuals went. But in the end, the symptoms are not murky at all. It's clear that there's been chaos at the jail for quite some time. Stories of locks failing, staffing gaps, not having any budget for repairs or maintenance, stopgap solutions in terms of the prisoners that were held in the jail that shouldn't have been, etc. So frustration is palpable at all levels, and from the front line saying, we tried to raise the issue, to the leadership saying, why didn't we hear anything? And the blame game has started. In business, this happens all the time too. There is not a business I've seen where this doesn't happen at some level. And yes, jailbreak is a little extreme. So you might not be heading for jailbreak anytime soon, but it's very likely that you have some issues internally that have that are not quite okay. A little broken lock here or there that you kind of know about and somehow doesn't seem to get fixed or repaired. And yeah, in this case, the blame game is in full swing. Blaming, or at least in the end, even if they find out or determine who's to blame, right? Which in this case is no doubt not a very black and white situation. Even if you find out, and in the end, we should all agree that all of us would have preferred that this didn't happen in the first place, right? Especially if there's people who are going to get hurt in the process, which is a realistic chance, then much better would have been prevention. And so it doesn't matter so much in the end how this unfolds. I think it's an excellent opportunity to remind ourselves that at the basis of chaos is often creep on little things that are dysfunctional and that we're not addressing. And they create ever-growing misalignment and little dysfunctionality upon little dysfunctionality until one day your whole system cracks and you have a jailbreak. Leadership today isn't just about scaling. It's about navigating constant uncertainty, market disruptions, and high-pressure decisions. If you're dealing with chaos, bottlenecks, and relentless pressure, welcome to the Business Emergency Room. As I said, you might say, well, Maartje, jailbreak is a bit of an extreme example. Sure. But that feeling of something not being right, of the buildup and the fatigue and the disconnect, that is actually something your teams might feel right now. So let's look at some numbers if you don't want to take my word for it. The average time to identify a critical internal failure in your business is 84 days. Yeah, 84 days. That's according to the Ponemon Institute. That's not me. That's almost a quarter. It can take almost a quarter to identify that you have a critical failure. What's also true is that only about 5% of frontline insights ever reach the executive decision-making tables. Only 5%. That's according to Bain. 5% might actually sound about right, depending on how many levels you have in your organization, right? Because there should be some natural filtering of what's really relevant for the leadership team and what they should be spending their time and effort on. The challenge is, what 5%? How good is that 5%? Well, research suggests that we as leaders underestimate minor issues 3 times more often than frontline teams. So let's assume that 5% that gets to us is actually the appropriate 5% that we should be hearing about. Chances that we actually hear it with the same urgency or the same importance or value attached to it that the frontline sees is actually very slim. So we will deploy our own filters and our own biases to us and underestimate likely how big a factor or how big an issue this is. So disconnects are costing us way more than you think. Way more. Let me give you some other examples of what's, on paper might be actually quite benign creep, but could still escalate into something major. One of my first jobs was working in industrial gases in Northwestern Europe. So imagine the big metal cylinders with oxygen, nitrogen, welding gases, etc. So before the EU tightened competition laws, there was a gentleman's agreement. So between the few companies that were out there, whoever had a gas bottle, first in a new customer's yard, that was their customer. And you would leave each other's customers alone. And that had been the business development mechanism for a long, long time. So what do you think the sales force did? It wasn't about persuasion, right? It was about maintenance. It was about swinging by, making sure if there was mishaps around delivery that you addressed with it, that you had an ongoing personal connection. But yeah, that was about it. So when the rules changed and competition opened up drastically, the sales teams, no sales teams involved here, sales teams weren't trained and they didn't shift. So imagine a sales rep managing a region, right? Because effectively they got a bunch of zip codes and had coffee with whoever was in that zip code. That's of course overly simplistic, but you know what I mean. So now they had the same region, but actually had to compete. So they actually had to talk to these clients about what they were using their gases for and how better to help them. If you want to sell a client more gases, well, what's the competitive advantage of your gas bottle over the competitor's gas bottle? For everybody else, apart from the markings, they're the exact same thing. It's regulated. It's the same product, same bottle, same pressure, same everything. So there's no differentiation in the bottles itself. The differentiation comes from selling the applications that go with it, from the service setup and systems that you have. It comes from you being able to identify that there's other things in the business that the client could actually use gases for in a manner that is helpful to them and their business. Well, if you're not trained on any of this, how are you going to sell any of it? Nothing got sold, and it was not because of market failure, but because the internal system hadn't kept pace. So there wasn't a catalog of applications. There wasn't a sales system saying, these are the problems the clients have. You should ask about X, Y, or Z. There wasn't a segmentation in the sales system or any of it. And it took years before it got changed. It took years because what happened was that there was mergers. And so there was suddenly different and other players coming into the system who had been operating in competitive markets. And so their systems were up to date and they were selling and they were taking over clients. If that's then the point that you need to start retraining a sales force that's been in their job for decades, you're behind the ball forever. Example 2. Later in my career, I was involved in automating procurement for high transaction contracts. So this was for offshore oil and gas platforms. So these were for, let's imagine there is a buyer sitting on the platform who is responsible to order all the consumables. Yes, there's also some bigger project scope, and they may or may not order some stuff for that, but it's really the chemicals that they use for the drilling, to the bolts that they use for the repairs, to the replacement of tools, other stuff that's needed to keep the platform running. And so in itself, we hadn't really, I was quite a junior team member, and in itself, we hadn't really run into many major issues or a lot of pushback in terms of the automation. But this was where, on paper, the biggest gain should be made, right? This is the high transaction stuff. And so if you automate it, I'm talking about a few decades back, that should be helpful, right? Make it a kind of an Amazon catalog. But we were getting immense pushback from all sides. So it was not just from the asset that we were getting pushback. We were also getting pushback from the vendors. and a few specific ones. And we were a little surprised because these were some of the bigger contracts dollar-wise. And so they should want to be kind of our good partners, we thought, because in theory, this would also help their volumes. But no, not interested. So it took a bit of to and throwing, and we ultimately actually mapped the processes. And what we found out is that these offshore buyers were not actually using the buying system as intended. So there was some kind of cataloging system set up. It was super labor intensive. So they had to look up what it is that they wanted to buy. And then they had to go through different catalogs and different contracts to figure out with which contractor or which company we'd set up a contract for them to buy off. And then they had to buy it off that contractor. And then they had to fill out all associated paperwork. And they all hated it. They hated it because it was not useful and not functional. And so what they did is that each and every one of them, right, on independent assets, and we think there was actually very little contact between them. So they all came up with the same simple solution, which was that some of the bigger contracts had a clause at the bottom of the contract and said, and anything that's not contained in this contract, we will buy for you. And then we'll just invoice you plus 10%, cost plus 10%, and we'll get it to you. And so if you're a smart contractor, you put a good guy, a good responsive guy or girl on the other end of the phone or the other end of the email and say, this is what you want, I'll get that. Because you can mark it up any which way to Sunday. And of course, if I'm sitting offshore and I need to buy a raft of things and I can just send somebody a list, and they will actually find all of it for me, ship it over as one order, or will keep me track of the whole thing as one order instead of 20 million different pieces of communication. Yeah. Of course I'm going to love that. And if nobody tells me off and the contractor gets paid and I get my stuff, why change? But you have to imagine that there was a lot of work that went in to competitively bid to get good rates for all these different items. So there was reasons, at some point, there were good theoretical reasons why different things were put in different contracts and should have been sourced from different people. And they hadn't been used in years. And so you do know that must have been signals everywhere because there were no good granular reports. There were contracts with line items in them that were never procured from these contracts. Somehow that never got reported or picked up. We had no good data on what was being bought and where. We were also not getting necessarily the good rates that we paid for. We might have had in some cases better rates, but probably in other cases we also paid way more because there was way more layers in the system. Yeah. And I don't think anybody in that system had bad intentions, and nobody was being corrupt or even lazy. People just don't want to work with something that's absolutely unworkable and annoying to do. So no traceability, no insights. And we had to, apart from automate the system, also fix a bunch of other stuff in the system and have a look at how we'd set up some of these contracts in general. So let's be real. You won't catch everything early, right? It's very natural that workarounds happen, or that there is something that gets flagged, just like at your house, right? You might have a loose doorknob on one of your interior doors. For some reason, it's always the bathroom. And you're like, yeah, I'll get to that. It'll get to it. And the only time you finally get to it is inevitably when there's some sweet kid that isn't yours that's stuck in the bathroom and the handle came off. Well, then you got to fix it. And that's typically you can all laugh about that, but that's what this is, right? That happens. It happens in life because there's so much that's there. So yeah, you're not going to catch everything, but the goal is to reduce the lag, right? To reduce the time between you identifying something is like that and actually doing something about it. Because before you know it, there's been locks in the jail that have been broken and have not been fixed. And everybody knows about it, including all the inmates, with enough time to actually plan a jailbreak. So, 70% of all transformations fail. And we know probably that number, right? That's a number that's out there. But do you know why? Because it's often due to internal misalignment. Yeah. That's in 70% of the cases. That's the reason that you have delays in your services, in your projects, in your products. Nothing to do with competition, nothing to do with stuff that you couldn't control. That's you internally having disconnects. Miscommunication consumes 40% of mid-level managers' time. Yeah. That's not necessarily meaning that they're spending 40% of their time fixing it, right? They're working on things that maybe shouldn't be worked on. That's in there too. And also, most businesses waste 20% or more on resources than needed due to duplicated work and friction. So, all in all, I think I've made the case. This needs work. You need to do something about this because, last but not least, if you have a lot of these issues and everybody knows about them and they don't get addressed, like having a jail with broken locks and broken doors and so systemically under-resourced and so systemically breaking all the rules around the processes and what this jail is supposed to be used for and which kind of inmates are supposed to be housed for. People get lackadaisious. They switch off. A third of employees, are disengaged because their employers are not dealing with these things. That's a lot. And you won't know because typically what happens is that these people slide into indifference. So they will stop escalating these issues and they will stop bringing them up. All right, enough about all the dysfunctions. Let's talk about what it takes to fix these. And some of it, right? Really, it's really 3 big ticket items that what you can do as a leader. And the big one, you hear it time and time again, is a culture of trust and transparency. So you need to be in a space where people continue to bring it up, where people are engaged enough and enthusiastic enough and trust you enough that if they told you the lock is broken and nothing happened about it, that they feel free and able and willing to a month down the line or a week down the line or in a prison or in a jail, should have been maybe sooner, they bring it back up and say, remember, those locks are broken. That should maybe be higher on the priority list. So now we're doing this. Shouldn't we be doing that first, for instance, right? You want to be in a space where people bring these things to your attention and don't stop doing that. And if there is no trust and transparency, if there's no freedom to bring up these things, if your people have disengaged or have been living with some of this mess and dysfunctionality for too long, you're not going to get it. And the trick is, if you have a high turnover of staff, the bigger risk is that your new people learn that this is normal. They weren't around. So maybe the decay has happened over a short period because it's just been huge upheaval. And so you're suddenly behind on a lot. Yeah, that's possible. The risk is if you then don't make extra efforts to close that gap and new people come in, that's their new normal. The point that they came in, the dysfunctionality that they found on day one is their normal. And they think that's okay. That's not where you want to be. So you need a culture of trust and transparency. Then the big one, go and see. Remember that only 5% from what the frontline brings up actually makes it to leadership. And that then we translate that quite poorly or we underestimate it. That we also don't always know if that's the right 5%. I'm a big fan of creating the time and space in your organization for people to go and see, for you to go and see, for your divisional leadership to go and see, for project team members who start on a new project or when you start engaging a new vendor or new supplier, new collaboration partner, that there is time for a go look see, time to actually understand what that looks like, how these people work, who they are, have some face-to-face time so that on day one, you stand a chance of understanding how people work. Virtual communication becomes so much better if there's been face-to-face time prior. It becomes more effective, it becomes more open, it becomes more transparent. So you need to go out there. Context matters. You need to ask your people or teach your leaders to go out there and ask the questions to the front line. What keeps them awake at night? What is the one thing that they would like to fix today to make their jobs better? What do they think is the biggest waste in their system at their end of the processes, etc.? Ask questions like that and then listen, because that will help you the next time you don't have time to go and see, but they escalate something up from the front lines. That will help you reduce your own biases in listening to what is being fed up, because you have better and more contextual information, and hence a much better chance at actually filtering out the stuff that needs addressing. If you don't address something, it's been escalated, you've heard it, and ultimately there's decision to not do anything about that issue right now. That's totally okay. That's your prerogative. I would communicate about that though. Communicate again transparently, because that will help build the trust. Say, I've heard you, I'm not ignoring you. I think for reasons A, B, and C that this is at the moment not the biggest priority. So not now, right? Not now, maybe not a no, but a not now. And then 3, you need a cleanup cadence. I've talked about this in the context of process decay too. This is something you can gamify. And the reason I think you should do this, because the opportunities are huge. Remember all these numbers I talked about the waste in the system and the time wasted, and the fact that if you don't find these issues and tackle them and make some time to tackle them, they creep and they explode. So can you do a competition or something, or a system where once a month, last Friday of the month, there is an hour or 2 hours in the system where everybody gets to propose something that they would like to change or alter or think is redundant? Or is there a running issues list that everybody gets to propose stuff that needs to go on there? So not risks, but issues that if we would clean them up, it would make a lot of people happier. Something that maybe your employees can also vote on and saying, yeah, if we would do this one, or if we make these changes in the leave request system, it would be so much better. Or, does anybody, or find the funniest thing. Does anybody know that we have a line item in our contracts that you can have this? Does anybody even know what it is? Or, the funniest thing is we've ordered one in the last 20 years. And then you can laugh about it, but you can also take it off, right? If you make it a game to find some of this stuff and create open and fun channels to bring up these things and actually address them, it engages your staff. It means that the creep gets stopped. It means that people know a way to get the creep stopped. And if you really take it to a fun space, then I bet you that the real serious stuff is going to come out outside of that system for sure. Because people know that this is an important subject, that you want to know where the dysfunctionality is because you believe in addressing it. And that dysfunctionality is a natural byfactor of growth. Yeah, no need to be embarrassed about it. It happens in our day-to-day lives all the time too, right? We all have it. It's more about what you do with it. So the jailbreak at our local prison, it didn't start with 10 people climbing out from behind a bathroom unit. It started years ago with broken locks and overlooked warnings and undertrained staff and budget compromises and creep around processes and creep around approvals and breakdowns in communications and collective fatigue. And in business, that is dangerous. And your version of a jailbreak may look like a failed launch or a key client walking away or a public crisis or system crashes. You don't know where the break might happen because the trigger might be small, but you're already overloaded with internal creep and it can knock you flat. And by then in a business, I'm not sure anybody's really interested in who's to blame in the end of it, because in business, it might be the end of it. So ask your team today, what keeps you up at night? What clogs your time? What's the one thing we could fix to make your job easier? And then shut up and listen and act. You hired smart people, and trust when they bring you signals from the front, because there's wisdom there. Even if it gets delivered or is, delivered on a plate with a healthy dose of frustration, and maybe not always in the friendliest way. Listen, because the longer creep continues, the harder it is to correct. And the sooner you catch it, the more power you have to prevent disaster or prevent ending up in chaos. And that's your job. Be the leader who acts before you end up with a jailbreak. So thanks for tuning in. I hope they, by the time you listen to this, they've managed to recapture these inmates and everybody managed to stay safe and whole and in one piece. One day, it will be a good story. Today, it's a scary thing, and it's something that could happen anywhere, unfortunately. So let's not let it go there. If you could use some help, because you have a bit of a backlog in terms of your creep, to kind of get back to healthier, manageable levels and make some strides in pushing some of it back, give me a call, set up a meeting. I'm here. I can help with that. So thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you or hear you here next time. Thank you. That's it for this episode of the Business Emergency Room. If you are currently dealing with chaos or disruption in your business, please reach out. You can email, text, or call, and I will find a way to connect with you within 24 hours. I've helped others steer out of the storm, and I know I can help you too. Talk soon. Please like, subscribe, and share.